Hi, I'm Lauren and I lead the IG Schools portfolio. And today I'm joined by Angela Donkin, Chief Social Scientist at the NFER, to discuss the recent report published around schools' responses to COVID-19 and the challenges facing schools and pupils as we embark on this new academic year. Angela, thank you so much for joining me today and for taking the time to help schools unpack this report a little bit more and the key findings that have emerged from your research. I know the report follows an earlier survey of schools in May, and then further data was collected in July. But would you like to start by telling us a little bit more about how this report came together? I know it's been quite a mammoth effort by the team.
Actually, yes, it has. So I manage basically the UK research and evaluation team. So we all had to kind of down tools and put a lot of effort into this to make sure that the research that came out was timely. So it's involved quite a few late nights. But I mean, I think that we felt that it was really important to kind of get in there early and see what was happening. Certainly at that time in May around remote learning and how teachers were coping with it, how they were coping in terms of how they felt about the stress. But also thinking about the level of engagement that children had with it. So that was in May. And then, of course, by July, the situation had changed and we were in a different environment where some children were in school and some weren't. And there were different questions being asked of policymakers, by policymakers, such as how far are they behind, and how are teachers and leaders coping with this kind of blended approach. So I think that from both of the surveys, we've got some really useful pointers that rather than dwell now on all the negatives, I think that there are some useful things in the research that we can maybe use to help us as we, as you say, move forward in this still new and unfortunately COVID present world.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you. That's really helpful, I think, to give a bit of context to this. And so one of the key themes to emerge from your findings is obviously around the need for learning recovery as a result of COVID-19 and the school closures, and really the importance of having tailored, targeted interventions. It's been, really well reported that the progress and attainment gap is an issue across the country, and that pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, in particular, will need additional catch-up support. But even with that, within that, the nuances of what's needed are obviously really vast. Can you talk a bit about your findings in relation to this and any recommendations you have for how to target interventions?
Yes, certainly. So because we knew that there weren't any tests or assessments in July, we had to think about how we would get some grip of how far children were behind in terms of their learning loss. So we asked about the extent to which they were behind in their curriculum learning and asked teachers to estimate. And on average, teachers estimated that children were about 3 months behind. Now, of course, there was some variation in that. And what we see is that actually there's a kind of 46%, about half gap between children in disadvantaged areas and children in less disadvantaged schools. Secondary schools were on average 2.5 months behind, primaries on average 3.5 months behind. Now, you might think, okay, well, actually then did remote learning achieve much? Well, some of the advice, of course, on remote learning at the beginning was to kind of consolidate what people had learned and maybe not go through new things. And so, that might explain some of that kind of general 3-month gap. The fact that schools were closed for 4 months implies that, remote learning maybe got through about a month of curriculum. And teachers actually said that on average they'd covered 66% of the curriculum, so it kind of matches there. So that's quite a substantial gap to catch up with. And we also found that we asked teachers what percentage of children they felt needed intensive catch-up, and on average, the teachers thought that 44% needed intensive catch-up. Again, more in the more deprived schools, slightly more in the Black and minority ethnic community as well. So lots of children behind, a definite disadvantage gap as most people expected, and so quite a task, I think, for teachers and leaders now coming into this kind of new environment, not only to kind of catch up, but also to kind of get on with the day-to-day curriculum that they would normally go through.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how do you think it's going to differ between leaders and teachers in terms of how they are able to, or maybe should, approach this catch-up period, if you like?
I think school leaders have had quite a lot on their plates, so they've had to think through how to open their schools safely, and to know that that's taken an incredibly large amount of time. I think that as the catch-up programs and money becomes available, I suppose the burden of thinking through what to do with that money will fall upon them in terms of how best to deliver it. And I think that so they've got quite a lot of big decisions that they need to make. And just to say, from our first survey, we found that those head teachers who had a better support network around them, whether or not that's from a school trust or from the local authority, felt better able to cope. So I think it is incredibly important that that support system is around head teachers at the moment to help them out. In terms of teachers, well, I mean, there's quite a lot in the reports, and let's think about what they need to do. So teachers at the moment need to teach in an environment that is different. So our research in July illustrated that about 3/4 of teachers actually felt that in terms of teaching in school, because by that time some children were back in school, that their teaching practices had been impacted and were different, and specifically negatively affected by social distancing. So for instance, they can't walk around the class and help a child who is struggling. They were limited in terms of the small group work. 40% of them didn't at that time have access to the resources they would normally have, because, for instance, they can't move around classrooms so much. So I think for teachers, there's one job now, which is to think about, okay, so given this new environment and the kind of best way to teach, how can I adjust my teaching to make sure that children are still engaged in the classroom? Then the other aspect for teachers is that some of the time they'll also be required to be doing remote learning. So that, balancing out the time between remote learning and in-school provision is probably going to fall to some extent to the leader. But our survey definitely illustrated some kind of pointers towards how we might improve remote learning. And it is important to say that remote learning is still with us. So if you are a teacher and you're self-isolating, you might be communicating with your children either in the classroom, or if they're older children, they might be going home and then having a lesson with you virtually. Or if the teacher is well, but the children are self-isolating or in a bubble, there is a expectation from DFE that remote learning will be provided. And so, again, that remote learning is continuing. If we had some other further kind of national lockdown, which I'm hoping we don't have, because hopefully the school's going to be prioritised, then that remote learning would come into play again. So, I mean, if helpful, I think what I'll do is just give some pointers about what we found was useful from remote learning. But I think before we even start about the delivery of remote learning, it's useful to say that there were a number of barriers, and the big one, obviously deprivation has a part to play here, but it was about IT access. And so in May, around a quarter of children didn't have, according to teachers, sufficient IT access in order to be able to make the most from remote learning. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a laptop or a computer in the house. It means that there wasn't either sufficient laptops and computers. Let's remember that in some families, more than one person would have needed that kind of equipment, or that they didn't have decent broadband Wi-Fi connection. So the government were making sounds about trying to get laptops to students, for instance, and I know there was some schemes around Wi-Fi. So it was a bit disappointing when in July we found that the same proportion still were in the same situation. So I would say, as a matter of priority, and especially for disadvantaged students, that we need to make sure that they have that IT access to be able to do that remote learning. Otherwise, we're not looking just at catch up from last year, we're going to be looking at catch up from this year. So I think that's incredibly important. Then let's move on to the delivery of remote learning. And I don't want to criticize anyone here, because I think that, you know, everybody was thrown into this situation completely new, having spent their lifetime teaching in a classroom, to suddenly having to do something completely different. And our kind of survey on what works in terms of engaging with remote learning was taken in May, when still it was quite new. But what we found is that schools who already had what is called a virtual learning environment, which might be something like Go for Schools, is it Go, or Google Classroom, but those kind of ways of communicating to a student about your homework and managing that. Those schools with virtual learning environments tended to have better engagement, because the children were used to looking online for work. And then in addition, online or telephone calls had better engagement than less interactive methods. And I think there's a discussion to be had here, because, you know, clearly there were some reports coming out suggesting that, you know, private school pupils were, you know, pretty much in Zoom lessons all day. And I think that there were a number of concerns, certainly in my local area, around safeguarding issues and using Zoom and having your cameras on and what you could do and what they couldn't do. And I think we need to get over those pretty quickly, like yesterday, in order to be able to ensure that children can actually see people, have some interaction. And linked to that was the issue of feedback. So children who were doing work, they were kind of they were receiving information, but they weren't really, nothing was being done to check on their progress, or very few, it's wrong to say nothing, but very few schools were, and it wasn't as consistent as it should be. So I think that, you know, I think at the beginning it's like, well, let's get some information to the children, and let's keep them engaged. But in terms of teaching and moving on and getting through, for instance, curriculum rather than revision, I think, you know, Zoom lessons, interaction, feedback, all need to change. The other thing is, it's not just children's IT equipment, but we found that, you know, some teachers were relying on their own personal equipment for IT, that wasn't sufficient, that they wanted better IT resources and some training. Because, you know, they were all of a sudden put into this, you know, new world. And I think that, you know, support for how teachers best do remote learning would be helpful. So they're just some pointers to moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really useful. And so just thinking back to, you mentioned there at the beginning about the importance of IT access, obviously, and the disparity between the May research and the July, and actually, you know, those same problems where the same percentages kind of experiencing those issues. Was there any change between, you know, by July, was it the same percentages experiencing the same issues, or was it perhaps that more had, you know, the hardware to they had the free laptops or iPads or something, but still didn't have the Wi-Fi access, for example, or did it kind of remain consistent? And then just to pick up on the kind of online safety point that you raised as well, and you could say being able to have Zoom lessons or understanding how to safely use cameras. Is there, is that kind of, does that have to be a school leader decision ultimately, do you think, or is there somewhere else that they should be looking for guidance? Is it a teacher by teacher decision? How do you think we can move a little bit further with that to overcome that as soon as possible for this term, really?
Yeah. So I think on the first point, we didn't distinguish, so I can't answer that question about whether or not it's laptops or broadband. I think it needs, a further look. Somebody could look at that. The second question about sorting out safeguarding. Well, I don't think it should be up to individual head teachers necessarily. I think that some clearer guidance, some enabling words, and advice is needed, because the small risk that somebody that sits in their bedroom in their pajamas, or somebody naked walks through the background is very, very small compared to, I think, the risk that children are losing out on their learning. And so I think it's one of those kind of over concerns, over safety concerns potentially. I mean, I don't know enough about the detail, but I do think that local authorities, school trusts should be working with children's commissioners and so forth to kind of work a way through this, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing some of your thoughts on that. And yeah, as you say, it needs to be a much wider conversation, and there are no easy answers necessarily, but some answers need to be found sooner rather than later, for sure. And so, yeah, obviously, as you said, teachers and leaders and the pupils have had to grapple with so much change this year. And the engagement now from pupils is going to be crucial in curriculum recovery, as well as continuing with curriculum delivery for the new academic year. You mentioned that maybe some of the marking or feedback procedures hadn't been where they needed to be perhaps in the last couple of months. So do you have any thoughts or recommendations for staff on how to improve that going forward, and more widely as well, how to kind of maintain pupil engagement now that we've started afresh this year, if you like, this September, and how to kind of boost their engagement through the next term, whether pupils are in the classroom, at home, or a mix, as is quite likely to be.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that it's, in terms of effective ways to improve attainment and to reduce the gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged, giving good feedback is on the EVE toolkit. So if anybody is wondering about best practice, the feedback is up there as an effective practice, and I'm pretty confident that the majority of teachers are very good at it, but in this different environment weren't quite sure how to do it. In this environment where I think at max, hopefully, children will be away for 2 weeks, it's maybe not as important. I think if we went into, but then still, I think, trying to find ways through the chat facility on an online conversation, or if you're not doing an online conversation, to enable children to post a question and get that answered, or if they submit some work, to have it marked and sent back, would be valuable, I think. But I think that maybe focusing on that aspect isn't as important if the breaks are short. But what concerns me is that you might be in a 2-week lockdown, go back, then somebody else is ill, and so forth, and it could just kind of like accumulate. Or in order to, the rumours around and abound all the time, but if at some point the government decided, right, we just need a short, sharp, extra month, that it does, it is important. And I think doing things differently, it is also important, because in May we had, about 60% of teachers were in contact with about 60% of their children, who weren't in contact with about 40% of them. We asked a kind of deeper engagement question about the percentage of work that the percentage of children who'd sent work back that had been set for return, and only 42% had sent anything back in May. Now that had gone down further in July, and I think that children and maybe teachers as well had kind of reached this kind of level of fatigue over remote learning, and they might kind of come back to it with a bit of a heavy heart. So I think like illustrating that it's a little bit different is an important thing.
Yeah, as you say, I think it's such a it's such a different environment to adapt to, and staff have had so much on their plates just trying to get to grips with working themselves in a new environment. Like you say, quite often relying on their own equipment, at trying to upskill in ed tech pedagogy as well as the tools, all in real time.
Yeah.
So they certainly kind of can't be blamed for reaching a level of fatigue, certainly by the end of the summer term.
Yeah.
And obviously, like you say, it's quite likely that there might be different pupils in and out of school. We might have local lockdowns. We hopefully not, but we might have a short national lockdown at some point. Do you think the Oak National Academy has got some hopeful potential at maintaining some continuity for engaging pupils with the lessons that they'll be providing?
I mean, we were going to ask specifically about that, the Oak Academy, and we didn't in the end, because we thought that there were so many different resources available, and that we didn't really necessarily want to single out one possible source of support. But potentially, I don't feel that I know enough about it. I mean, I think, obviously if teachers want to try, or leaders want to try and get some help, then there are a number of places that they can look for it. But going back to kind of this general burden on teachers and leaders, I think what I want to mention is this issue around resourcing, because head teachers have had a huge amount on their plate, and teachers now maybe needing to do a mixture of face-to-face and online learning, depending on which class and what the situation is. And they also the schools have also had to put in place social distancing measures. We found that in May, when we asked about reopening schools safely and managing with distance learning and blended learning in the classroom, a number of teachers and leaders had mentioned more money. Leaders rather had mentioned that they needed more resources. So we went into that in a little bit more detail in the second survey, and found that actually primary schools were wanting about 20% more than the kind of average local authority budget, and primary schools about 10% more. And that's just to kind of cover things like cleaning costs, if sometimes more teachers and more cover to cope with the additional responsibilities. So and we find it as well more generally, whether or not it's in a pandemic or outside a pandemic, there's this kind of ethos that teachers should be, you know, learning and using the best examples, but they need time in order to get that information into their head and learn it, and, you know, have time to absorb. But this is kind of on the back of certainly running up for the last few years, increasing levels of teacher workload. So I think that, and then on top of that, over the pandemic, a number of teachers were, for instance, walking round to individual pupils' houses because they were worried about them, or pupil safeguarding issues, the mental health support that may be required. So we're always adding on additional kind of burdens onto schools at the moment, and I think that we need to think very carefully about whether or not they have got enough resources. And one of the kind of ways of thinking about it is that they realised that the NHS wouldn't be able to cope, and they found loads of volunteers and you know, thought through a different way of doing things. And I'm just wondering whether or not, you know, they've really thought about the burden on schools and whether or not they need more.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, maybe that is a conversation that needs to be had, and somebody, whether that's the Department of Education or more broadly, does kind of spark some kind of initiative related to how the NHS volunteer scheme was set up. But just to pick up on your point about mental health and mental well-being there, I mean, in the research that we've done at IG schools this year with our you know, schools community across the country, I think for leaders as well as teachers, we've certainly found that mental health is a huge priority for schools. And coming back into this academic year, not necessarily something that trumps the importance of teaching and learning, but certainly mental health is very much at the forefront of you know, efforts to settle children back in,
yeah,
and get ready really to start learning, rather than expecting that teaching and learning can kind of pick up from where they left off back in March. So again, is that something that came up quite a lot in your research, or not so much because it wasn't quite the focus of?
Yeah, we didn't look at, we didn't ask teachers how they thought their students were feeling, for instance, because it's quite a difficult thing for them to know remotely. So we didn't think that would be very valid. What we did do, though, in July is ask them about what their priorities would be for returning back to school in September. And absolutely a majority said that they would prioritise the social and emotional well-being of pupils, you know, first, and, you know, above all else at the beginning, definitely. Now, whether or not that has actually transpired, or whether or not they're doing that in addition to kind of trying to assess where they are, I mean, I imagine there'll be a big difference. But yes, I mean, I don't think we really know. I think there was another study done on the mental health of children, which I think that found, although it kind of low levels of, you know, in terms of well-being, it was slightly higher, but depression had gone up. Obviously, it's going to vary a lot by individuals, and yeah. So, but not the focus of our study.
Yeah, but thank you for sharing your thoughts on that in any case. And obviously, for anybody that hasn't had a chance to take a look through your research yet, we'll post links to the most recent report in September, and some of the previous research that led up to that as well, below this recording. But is there any other kind of final points you'd like to make today, or any other issues you'd you know, like to highlight?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, I don't think so. Nothing massive. I just suppose I'd focused on the IT issue and the disadvantage. I just wanted also to maybe mention a little bit about other groups that were less engaged. So the SEND group of students were less engaged, and also young carers. And, you know, I think just further thought about, you know, children being at home with their parents, and if they are a young carer, will they have the time to catch up? Just a further kind of consideration if there is a long period of lockdown, but hopefully not.
Yeah, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. And do you think, you know, is that another thing that schools really need more support with, maybe, is being able to provide the support for pupils who are carers, for example? Do you think schools kind of know enough about how to go about that, or know enough about those needs? Or do they need further support from, you know, perhaps local authority service providers or something?
Yeah, I mean, you know, with carers or with vulnerable children or people that they're concerned in terms of their mental health, I think that, you know, the fact that school staff were walking around checking on children, the fact that actually a number of leaders and teachers were very concerned about some children, does speak to the fact that schools can't do everything on their own. And actually, you know, those kind of wraparound social support services are absolutely needed and need to be supporting and working with schools to make sure that children are okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for this conversation today. I feel like we've managed to cover quite a lot in quite a short space of time, actually. So, as I say, it's been brilliant to delve into this research a little bit more and think about what it could mean and how it can help inform how we go about this next academic year. So congratulations again on the research report, and we look forward to more insights from the NFER team in coming weeks and months.
Okay, my pleasure. Thanks for the
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.